pending in Rome as we speak. It was started by our late Archbishop Cardinal Francis George back in 2010. And Rome gave us permission to set up the historical commission to do the research into his life. And it took us 4.5 years to explore various archives and libraries to find trace and evidence of wherever he was. From Brush Creek, Missouri, where he and his family were enslaved on a farm owned by a Catholic family by the name of Stephen and Sevilla Elliott. And then the escape across the Mississippi River to get to the state of Illinois, which was theoretically a free state during the time of our Civil War. Civil War started 1861. The owner of the Toltons, Stephen Elliott, died without a will. And his wife, Sevilla, had to sell off some of the animals on the farm equipment, and even some of the slaves because he died heavily indebted. Man had a lot of bills that were unpaid. Martha Jane, his mother, Tolton's mother, had already been given away as a wedding gift when she was a young girl off of a farm in Kentucky, what is today Louisville, Kentucky. And so she never saw her parents again, Matilda Hurd and Augustus Chisley, her father. We just recently found his mother's grave last year in the backyard of St. Mary's Catholic Church in a brushed area. She's buried here, and her owner is buried about 20-some feet in back of her. When the war broke out, it was a very precarious situation, as you know from the history books. Abraham Lincoln had signed a decree freeing the slaves, especially in territories in the South. Historians debate which was the real reason for the war. Was it the succession of so many states that were breaking away from the Union and wanted to go on their own? Or was it the issue of the morality of slavery? Historians debate that. It probably was a both and. Abraham Lincoln wanted to bring the South to its knees in order to somehow deplete them so much, get into their economy in order to bring them back to the Union. And of course, the South, who took on the name of the Confederacy, pushed back rather seriously. And that war caused well over 600,000 casualties on the battlefields of this country. They say the largest human loss of any war that we've ever been engaged in. More than World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam War individually. So it cost a lot, not only on the battlefield, but people off the battlefield. Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863, and that cut directly into the engine of the economy of this country, which was slavery, forcing people to work the economy of this country without being paid for it. Them and their ancestors were taken away from the African continent to do our work, to do our labor. Unfortunately, the freeing of the slaves didn't offer much. There was no program of assimilation or adjustment to a people who were, for the most part, uneducated, didn't know anything about life in this country other than the place where they were enslaved. Consequently, they were pushed out into society to be treated, for the most part, haphazardly. And by time of the war, and even at the end of the war, the issue was not solved. Some say it has not been solved to this day. The South somehow collectively reacted to Abraham Lincoln by killing him in the name of John Wilkes Booth. That was the South's answer for Abraham Lincoln and his actions. What some people consider one of the greatest, if not the greatest, presidents of our country. But it took the country another 100 years to somehow figure that maybe Black people have souls, they're human beings, and they are entitled to everything else that everybody works for in life. That was 1964, with the Civil Rights Act, and then 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. But Augustus Tolton would never see those things. In the midst of the war, with Martha Jane seeing all these people coming along the farm in Brush Creek, Missouri, where they were, and dilly-dallying and placing price tags and everything, we have the bill of assessment, financial assessment of all the slaves who were on the farm. His mother was valued at $50, and her brother at $100, and little Tolton was valued at $25. And this made Martha very, very nervous. She figured that either she would be taken away from her children or her children taken away from her. So she decided to run. The Underground Railroad in those days was a secret organization where slaves who escaped their masters could get from one point to another, from one point to another, with lookouts and people who at each stop could tell them where to go next in order to avoid recapture. Because in many instances, to be recaptured and taken back to your owner could be very, very disadvantageous. People who were whipped, or people who had a foot cut off so they couldn't run anymore, people raped, their kids taken away from them, all kinds of horrendous experiences that featured slavery at that time. She decided to run with 3 children. One was a babe in arms, another 2, Tolton was 9 years old at the time. And she made her way to Hannibal, Missouri, where there were Union troops who were encamped there. On the way, she was accosted by Confederate bounty hunters who were going to take her back because Mrs. Elliott had given a retainer to a man by the name of Thompson. She gave him $20, and she said, "Go find them and bring them back." But he never found them. Almost like a deus ex machina, when the Confederates had accosted Martha and the 3 children, the Union troops had descended on the scene and reminded the slave catchers that they were standing on Union soil, so they had to give up the slaves they had just caught to the Union soldiers, which made them very, very angry. The Union troops took her to the shore of the Mississippi River. Now, the Mississippi River was almost like, I suppose, the Red Sea, with the Israelites trying to get across to freedom from the Egyptian pharaohs. If you could get across the Red Sea, you could get to the state of Illinois, which was theoretically a free state. So they put her in this boat. Luckily, mysteriously, they found on the shore near Hannibal a rowboat. It was dilapidated and had 1 oar. And they told Martha, "Madam, this is as far as we can go. You have to take it further." So they put her into the rowboat with the 3 children, and she began rowing. She had never rowed a boat in her life. And it was a difficult struggle given the strong currents of the Mississippi that were running at that time. There weren't the dams and the docks and so forth that kept or slowed down the river flowing currents. And while she did that, the Confederates started shooting at her with their muskets. Luckily, they missed. They were not very good shots, but they missed. But she ended up rowing all night, and she arrived on the other side of the state of Illinois. And she fell down on the shore, and she grabbed her children in her arms and told them, "Children, never, ever, ever forget the goodness of the Lord." She met some other people with the Underground Railroad who directed her an additional about 23 miles into a town which is still today known as Quincy, Illinois. Quincy was a town that was pro-slavery on one side and anti-slavery on another. And she managed to settle in a town a part of the town that had a number of free slaves, escaped slaves, people in between or whatever. And there she decided to do the best that she could to somehow navigate the choppy waters of racial acceptance, which was a mixed experience. She made it across the river, luckily. A lot of people didn't. A lot of them drowned in the river, trying to escape. A lot of them were killed en route. Being raised Catholic herself, because her owners were Catholic, her children were also baptized Catholic in Missouri, she tried to get Augustus and his sister Anne into St. Boniface German Parish, which still does sit on the main street of Quincy, Illinois. And that was well enough and good until a group of parents rose up and threatened the pastor of the church that if he didn't get rid of this black child, they would stop their contributions to the church. So Father Schiffermeyer, who was pastor there, had to expel the boy, Tolton, from the school. After that, she decided to put him in a public school, and en route to that, he was getting further and further beyond in his academics. In the meantime, she needed to find some sort of a work in order to raise herself and her children. I might mention here, her husband, Peter Paul, the father of Tolton, had joined the Union Army to fight for freedom. The great orator Frederick Douglass had lobbied Abraham Lincoln to allow black men to fight on the Union side. And it took Abraham several years to really allow that. The first organized troops of black men fighting for the Union didn't appear until 1863. Some of you may have seen the Hollywood movie Glory. That was the story about the 33rd Massachusetts Regiment of black men who were mostly wiped out during the war with the assault on Battery Wagner there in the Carolinas. But Tolton's father had died, and we have his death certificate, his entry papers into the Union Army and so forth. He got sick due to all of the kind of rampant diseases that ran through the camps, dysentery, lack of hygiene, and so forth and so on. But Martha didn't find out that her husband was dead for about 8 years when she found his name on a list of Civil War casualties. We have his death certificate, and then she was allowed a pension of $8 a month until she died in 1911 here in Chicago. She's buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery, right off of 111th Street. Augustus was put in a public school, and he started his elementary education at the age of 15. And he ended up being removed from that school because he was bullied a lot. He was a tall, lanky adolescent who smelled of tobacco all the time, and nicotine, because he and his mother worked in this tobacco factory in order to eke out some sort of an existence for their family. And around that whole area were a lot of tobacco farmers. And one of the biggest industries in that Missouri-Illinois section was raising tobacco for cigars and cigarettes and those kinds of things. It was a tough kind of a job. To this day, doctors say working in an environment like that and smelling the fumes, that sort of thing, obviously left Tolton with some residual effects on his body, which we learned only later. After the public school experience, Augustus was found standing outside of St. Peter Church in Quincy, staring at this big, beautiful edifice. And the pastor came out and saw him and asked him who he was and so forth and so on, and what school he went to. And when he found out that Augustus was not in school, he took Augustus home and began talking to his mother, Martha, and telling her that, why don't you let them come, your children come to my school, St. Peter's, and if there's any trouble, I'll take care of it, which he did. Augustus went to St. Peter's School, and he began to develop rather rapidly. He learned everything, the academic basics. He even began picking up conversational German because that was the language of Quincy at the time. That area had many, many German settlements, migrants and so forth. And he took up a part-time job in the church as a janitor. And in the midst of his cleaning and sweeping and that sort of thing, he was found in church praying a lot. And they noticed that he had religious leanings about him. He was a spiritual kind of a kid. And they tried to get him into a seminary to see if perhaps he might have a religious vocation to the priesthood. But in those days, no seminary in the United States would take a black man. Like many other institutions, higher education or whatever. But they wrote, it took them about 7 or 8 years getting no for an answer or no answer at all, until the Franciscan friars who have St. Peter's Church downtown Chicago on Madison Street, they wrote their superior in Rome to see if he could get admitted into one of the seminaries in Rome. And he eventually, after 2 years of writing and asking for admission, they finally accepted him into the Urbanum Seminary, or the Urban Seminary, that was ran by the Propaganda Fide. The Propaganda Fide is a department of the Vatican that trains young men to become priests in far-off mission lands. So in 1880, he said goodbye to his mother and his sister. He probably felt that he would never see them again. After taking several trains to get over to New Jersey, and a ship that took him to Le Havre, France, then a couple more trains down to Rome. He landed in the Vatican. He stayed there 6 years and studied theology and philosophy, the classics and so forth. And then in 1886, Easter Vigil, he and his class were ordained priests. They were going to send him to Africa to work as a missionary because they figured that he could not be a success in the United States given our apartheid. In fact, that was the actual vote, to send him to Africa. But the night before he was ordained a priest, Cardinal Giovanni Simeoni took him aside and said, "Well, Augustus, the vote was to send you to Africa for your first assignment as a priest, but I overruled them. I'm going to send you back home. You know, your country considers itself to be the most enlightened nation on the face of the earth, and if that's true, they should be able to accept a black priest. And if they have never seen one before, they'll see one now." So in July of 1886, he hopped another ship to come back to the United States. He landed in New Jersey and said his mass there for a group of sisters in a convent there. And then he took a series of trains to get back to the Diocese of Alton in Illinois, the city of Quincy, where he came from in the first place. They gave him a grand reception, a huge band playing Holy God, We Praise Thy Name. He saw his mother again for the first time since he had left originally to study. Even certain people from St. Boniface who kicked him out as a kid came out to greet him. His first assignment actually was a mission church of this St. Boniface church for blacks. There was only about 30 or so of them at the time, and he was given that assignment. And things were going pretty well for him until the assignment of a new pastor at St. Boniface by the name of Michael Weiss. Michael Weiss was an indefatigable kind of an individual, and he despised Tolton for the simple reason in those days it was illegal to have blacks and whites in the same room together under the same roof, and even in churches. And unbeknownst to Tolton, there were white citizens of Quincy who were sneaking into his masses on Sunday. He became something of an attractive figure in the name of his pastoral ministry, his open nature for welcoming everybody into his church. But a whispering campaign began with some area clergy, both Protestant and Catholic, who somehow accused Tolton of poaching other churches to get people to come into his church, which was not the case. This Michael Weiss kept bullying Tolton, telling him to stay away from the whites and to shoo them away if they came, and that the money that they put into his church really belonged to St. Boniface. That was an irritant in his mind, and he never let go of that. He kept running back to the bishop, complaining about Tolton, on and on and on. And it was upsetting Tolton. It was affecting him emotionally. As a kid, he was tutored by priests and nuns in Quincy to get him a start in life as a former slave. And in that experience, he saw for the first time the goodness of the church, the goodness of Catholic Christians on his and other people's behalf. And for the first time, he saw the other side, the ugly side, the intolerant side of some people. And he had a hard time reconciling that. His experience in Rome for 6 years, he wrote in one of his letters to Catherine Drexel, everybody here loves me, and I don't know why. Because Rome has always been a cosmopolitan city. Any and everybody, whoever they were, whatever the race they were, language they spoke, could come to Rome and live in Rome, going all the way back to the ancient times of the Caesars and so forth. Those countries never had problem with race prejudice. They had problems of other kinds of prejudice, but it was not race. It was usually built in the conquest of land and wars and those kinds of things. So this kind of whispering campaign was going on, and it was getting out of control. Finally, the bishop told Tolton, unless you can take care of your own situation there at St. Joseph's, you're going to have to get out of town. Tolton did not know what to do because he was being pushed up to a wall, so he wrote his superiors in Rome at the propaganda and asked them what he should do. They advised him to stay put for a while in his assignment, which he did, because he took an oath, like any other priest, that you go where you're sent. We're not our own free agents. We can't decide where we go. We belong to the church, and the bishop gives us orders, and we follow them. That's the nature of the game. But things were getting out of control. In the meantime, the Archbishop of Chicago was hearing about all of this. He was an Irish gentleman originally from Nashville, Tennessee, by the name of Patrick Fian. And in Chicago at that time, this is the 1880s, the blacks were in a similar situation as they were in the rest of the country. But St. Mary's Church in 9th and Wabash had a group of about 60 African Americans. Some of them were former slaves, freed slaves, people in between, and they had no one to pastor them. So Patrick Fian heard about all this trouble that Quincy was going through, so he invited Tolton to come to Chicago. But in order to come to Chicago, he had to have permission from Rome to do so. So he began writing Rome, but the answers were slow in coming. In those days, we didn't, the postal system was nothing to speak of. And any mail had to be sent over by a ship. God knows how long it sat there before it was delivered in order any answer to come back here. So it took long, and in the meantime, Tolton was getting more and more upset. In fact, he told the Roman authorities, I think I'm going to have to go somewhere before I get your response. It's becoming really intolerable. He had searched several other dioceses, Galveston in Texas, the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and in Chicago. Those were the three strongest prospects for him. So finally, Rome sent an answer. They first wrote his bishop, James Ryan, who was a peculiar kind of gentleman. And Bishop Ryan took his time answering Rome. Rome wanted to know what's going on with Tolton. We thought things were working out for him. And the bishop sent back a terse response saying, it is impossible to carve out a ministry here with former slaves. And he pointed the finger at Rome. He says, this assignment did not come from me. It came from you people in Rome. So you have to handle it. James Ryan was angry because this thing had been thrown in his lap. The straw that broke the camel's back was a wedding. There was a socialite in Quincy, a young woman, who came from some measurable means. Her mother used to give a lot of money to the church. And she had some gentleman she would like to marry. And her mother didn't approve of the man she wanted to marry. So mother went around to the 5 churches in Quincy at that time, and she told the pastors not to marry her daughter because she did not approve of who she picked out as her fiancé. But she didn't figure on Tolton. Unbeknownst to the mama, the young lady went to Tolton and asked Father Tolton to have her wedding, which he did, and all hell broke out. The news of a socialite in Quincy being married by a black man blew the roof off the ceiling of the town, and he was told to get out of town. So he packed his things, didn't say much at all to anyone except his mother and sister and a few people. And the week before Christmas, 1889, he got on the train and arrived at Chicago. He was put up in a sort of like a small tenement efficiency apartment where McCormick Place is today. That was the neighborhood we first lived in until they could find him something larger. He promised his mother that once he got settled, he would send for her and his sister because he feared that they would be recaptured and taken back into slavery. I don't know if you ever saw the Hollywood movie 12 Years a Slave. It starred Brad Pitt and the Nigerian actor Chiwetel Ejiofor. It was a story about Reconstruction after the Civil War, where the Ku Klux Klan and other vigilante groups would go after black men who had achieved anything after the Civil War. They would recapture judges, people in politics, teachers, and so forth, sneak up on them and throw them back into slavery. And this is a true story of Nathaniel Northrop, who was quite a successful businessman. And 2 white men took him to dinner and ingratiated themselves to him and then kidnapped him. And they threw him into slavery again for 12 years. His family didn't know where he was. Nobody knew where he was. Brad Pitt is the man who saved him. And one of the most powerful scenes of that film is when Nathaniel knocks on the door of his family home again and sees his family for the first time. They didn't know he was coming. They had left him for dead. That happened a lot during the Reconstruction period. So Tolton came to Chicago, and after about a year or two, Archbishop Fian asked him to lay plans for a church at 36th and Dearborn Street. That would be for black Catholics. The Irish had their church, the Germans had theirs, the Italians, the Lithuanians, everybody had their own church. Which he laid plans, and they constructed it up to about the first level. Chicago is famous, as you know, for its extremes of weather. We can get some pretty, like we did a few weeks ago, 10 and 11 below zero. We can get some pretty hot, humid days. Well, the first week of July, 1897, Chicago was hit with one of its famous heat waves, where temperatures on successive days were 100 degrees, 103, 110. And in those days, if you can imagine, without electricity, there was no such thing as fans, no such thing as air conditioning. So you had to make do however you could make do. Father Tolton had come back on a retreat for priests down in Bourbonnais, Illinois, and he got off at the 35th Street station in Chicago on Lake Park. And he was walking back to his rectory, a distance of about 10 blocks. But once he got off the train, he collapsed at 36th and Ellis Street. In those days, with train travel, which was the superior means of travel in this country, you had a series of train cars, and for blacks, there was only one car. And if there weren't enough seats, you had to stand until a seat was relieved, having stopped at some particular station. Father had already been showing some signs of illness, if not some kind of a Parkinson's. In those days, blacks could not go to hospitals or have any sort of health care in those days. Most people somehow created stuff in the kitchen to handle normal, everyday kinds of illnesses and maladies and so forth and so on. But there were other things that obviously were untreated for a lot of people, blacks as well as whites. One of those was hypertension, another one's cardiac problems, tuberculosis, and other kinds of diseases. Well, they rushed Tolton to Mercy Hospital on the south side of Chicago. It was ran by the Mercy Nuns, and they begged the sisters to take in this black man to see what they could do for him. And that was about 12:30 that day on July 9th. They worked on him till about 8, a little after 8 in the evening, and then he died. His death certificate mentions heat stroke with some complications of uremia. Another priest in Evanston died on that same day, Otto Grunwald. He had his ticket to go to Germany to visit his family, but he collapsed in his rectory on July 9th. Those are the two priests who died on that day in the city. And the newspaper clippings from that period, we have them all, list the names of people who were discovered in their homes around the street who had died from that terrible heat crisis in the city of the first week of July 1897. Father asked his mother before he died that if anything happened, he would like to be buried back in Quincy, not Chicago, which was a very interesting glimpse into his personality. Even despite everything that happened to him in Quincy, the mixed experience that it was, he still harbored an affection for that town. It came to his rescue as a young man and launched him further into life, even though society and the church were not ready for him and his ministry or his leadership, simply because the country, and it spilled over into the churches, could not imagine that a black man could ever wear one of these. And Cardinal George read his biography, and then he asked, he mentioned to me that this is the definitive biography of Father Tolton, From Slave to Priest. It came out in about 1972, and he said, I would like to ask Rome to see if they would name Father Tolton a saint after all we put him through. And so his cause has been running since 2010. After the dossier was approved by Pope Francis in June of 2019, the Pope ruled that Father Tolton lived a life of heroic virtue and advanced him to the title of Venerable. Now we are waiting for a miracle, an inexplicable miracle that would advance him to being beatified. And that's what we pray for every day. The prayer, the official prayer, is on the other side of this picture. There's the prayer card. That's the official prayer. It's also mentioned in the prayer leaflet. The other book that we have there, after the first book, From Slave to Priest, which was the definitive biography of Tolton, after we did the research that we sent over to Rome, we learned some other historical facts about Father Tolton that were not available in the archives at the time in which we first started this cause. And that came out with Joyce Duriga's book, Augustus Tolton, The Church is the True Liberator. And then we have that graphic novel there for young people. I don't know who likes it most, the adults or the kids. But we're proud of this. First recognized Black Catholic priest in America. These are on sale for anyone who likes them. So that's kind of in brief the story of Father Gus. I don't know if